Hello friends, Reverend Aaron Stockwell here. There was a internet outage at the end of our service in the middle of my sermon, so I am re-recording the sermon for you from my study. Asking people what they see. Well, what do you see? If sight is challenging, what do you sense about the world? Been thinking a lot these days about how light illuminates objects, how the amount of light sources and the angle can change how you view things, how the color and the position impacts your experience of an object, how you can really use light to paint. It's an ephemeral paint, the ultimate temporary, washable, not permanent paint. I love the work of James Tyrell for this reason. Tyrell is a minimalist American artist who primarily uses fluorescent LED lights to create his art. The way he uses shadows and white walls to create different colors and shapes to the art. He uses light and by extension dark to create what our eyes perceive as physical objects. There's one large piece at Mass MoCA in North Adams, where you step into a room that I presume is painted white, yet the light shifts and your perception of color changes, and furthermore, it feels as though you are completely surrounded by pure color, not a drywall, painted gallery room in an old factory, which is where you really are. As the Los Angeles Contemporary Museum of Art catalog of his work says, Tyrell had noticed that our perception varies in common situations as well. At dusk, a red flower will appear darker and blacker, while a blue one will appear to be brighter. This is because when light is present, our sight relies on the cones of the retinas. In darkness, it depends upon the rods. When the shift between cones and rods occurs, human vision is compromised, leaving us colorblind. And in total darkness, the other senses become triggered and awareness is heightened. As an aside, it would be interesting to consider how we use light, colors, and the beautiful architecture of our meeting house sanctuary a little bit more. Perhaps all of this is true because during the winter is when we notice darkness coming. We want to hold on to light for as long as possible, forgetting that darkness can bring warmth and restorative rest. We forget what good can come from the darkness. Light illuminates objects. Light illuminates objects, but darkness does something to it as well. These past 20 months, I've often thought about how the light hits my face on Zoom calls. I become acutely aware about how to get the lighting on my Zoom calls just right. How the amount of light sources can change the mood of a video chat. How it can change the message of a video sermon or make a meeting feel different. Nighttime board meetings feel spooky when only one side of my face is lit. Now, early on, when all preachers got a battlefield promotion and became brevet film producers, I went down the YouTube rabbit hole and learned about three-point lighting, where you have three sources of lighting. A key light on one side, an accent light on the other, but just off camera, and a hair light or a backlight, sometimes shining at the person's hair or shining at the background to create some sort of definition, to make the subject pop. I used all of those techniques for our service videos that I created here. It's a little behind the scenes look. I did make sure that my face was well lit. No shadows. But ensuring that the objects we film or record in our memories are well lit from both sides with no shadows on their face is artificial. Everything has a shadow. Perhaps we are keenly aware of this during this time of the year. We only have to look at the moon to see this truth. Based on the position of the earth, the sun, and the moon can appear to be whole, half, waning or waxing, or completely disappeared. Perhaps we are keenly aware that everything has a shadow because we live in a depression or a funk, because we have been hurt. Shadows aren't bad. They're just cast when you put an object between a light source. When you look at the world, how is it lit? If the world is evenly lit with hope and despair, then what? If shadows obscure, maybe it is time to rest. If it is bright with hope, maybe share that with somebody else. For whatever reason, we have equated hope with light and despair with dark. The dark night of the soul usually means a depression, a loss of hope, the darkness of the womb, singing morning has broken. But what about the darkness of the womb then? What do you do when you have both despair and hope? I think it is important to preach or notice that everything has a shadow and everything is illuminated. It is a disservice to preach every sermon announcing that the world is on fire, just as it's a disservice to read only news stories sharing how much despair there is. It would also be a disservice for the poet to only write praise poems. When you get upset that you have burned a pumpkin pie in the oven, it's because you were really hoping to eat that pumpkin pie. To preach that the world is on fire implies that the world is worth saving. There is something to redeem. There is always something to redeem. Remembering what is joyful and important is what we need to remember in order to save the world. For even in a world of despair, the dishes still need to get done. There's no pure praise poem because even the best praise poems contain some despair. Even the best praise poem contains some acknowledgement that the world isn't how it is meant to be. I do not want to convince you to notice only the good or the bad, the hope or the despair. You have permission to notice what you notice, as Verlin Klinkenborg wrote. However, to notice only despair means only that you have calibrated your spiritual antenna to pick up the despair radio waves, which is okay. If someone is clinically depressed, it might be nigh impossible to look for joy. Maybe just noticing things helps. You learn different things about the world. It's like, say, if you went on 4 separate walks in a national park that was filled with soaring landscapes, beautiful nature, and historical artifacts. And on that first walk, you went with a geologist. And as you walk, they pointed out all of the landscape and the rocks and how they got to be the shape that they are. You turn around and you go on a hike with the biologist on the same trail. And they point out all of the plants and the animal life. For the third hike, you go with an anthropologist and they point out all of the artifacts and the signs of civilizations that lived there before. And then you go alone on the 4th hike. And you see everything, but you notice other things as well. Maybe you notice that you are struggling, actually. Where have our attentional habits focused? To notice only the despair and only record the despair is an insult to the beauty that exists in the world. I think it was either poets Jane Hirschfield or Ellen Bass who said that. Heard it said during a poetry webinar series, and I haven't quite figured out which one of them said it. To notice only the despair and only to record the despair is an insult to the beauty that exists in the world. I think we do a disservice to live as if we are only in the light, or if we are always in the shadows. Can we live with both hope and despair? Maybe the glass isn't half full or half empty. Maybe the glass is simply beautiful. There are different ways of looking at an object. Even though Icarus is famous for falling, everyone forgets that Icarus also flew, the poet Jack Gilbert writes. I wonder what was the shadow he cast as he fell. In a world that seems to be on fire, what then is the place of hope? What is the place of joy? Ross Gay writes that joy only exists in the shadow of terror. By talking about despair, we are noticing that the world isn't how it is meant to be. By talking about the necessity and the desire for there to be more hope or something to hope for, we are engaging in a science fiction. We are actually engaging in an act of seeking social justice. Which is really what all social justice efforts are. They're all about science fiction when you zoom out and look at them from a 50,000-foot view. Social justice is about imagining what the future might be, in spite of all of the odds. I like what Walter Brueggemann says in his monumental work about prophetic imagination, when he says that the prophet engages in a futuring fantasy. The prophet does not ask if the vision can be implemented, for questions of implementation are of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. The imagination must come before the implementation. Our culture is competent to implement almost anything, to imagine almost nothing. The same royal consciousness that makes it possible to implement anything and everything is the one that shrinks imagination because imagination is a danger. Thus, every totalitarian regime is frightened of the artist. Every totalitarian regime is frightened of the artist. Why? Because most activists are artists, and most artists are activists. There's always a story to tell and to share with others. Brueggemann closes by saying, "It is the vocation of the prophet to keep alive the ministry of imagination, to keep on conjuring and proposing futures alternative to the single one the king wants to urge as the only thinkable one." There is world-changing possibility in what is imagined, eternal possibility. So where do we find hope? Maybe we have to recalibrate our hopometers. Hope, for me, is more what Miguel de la Torre, a progressive Baptist theologian, writes about, when he reminds us that the English sense of the word hope implies a kind of pausing in anticipation of something good that is about to be revealed. De la Torre reminds us that the Spanish word for hope, esperar, means something drastically different: to wait in apprehension of either good or evil. He continues on to say that the usage of the Spanish word connotates a darker, more complex meaning that implies fear of what is awaited. To wait doesn't always imply a happy ending, especially if the waiting drags on for centuries. Now, later in the winter, I want to talk about the practice of lament as a way to live into hope or hopelessness. But for this Sunday, I now want to shift to explore the holiday that the people of the Jewish faith are observing and celebrating this week. And as Unitarian Universalists, it is possible and a right way that many Unitarian Universalists are to also practice Judaism. So some of our Unitarian Universalist families are observing and celebrating Hanukkah. I draw much of my description of this holiday from the book These Are the Words by Rabbi Arthur Green. In These Are the Words, he describes Hanukkah as the 8-day early winter festival that celebrates the victory of the Maccabean rebels over the rulers in the year 165 BCE. The events of this period are recorded in the books of the Maccabees, written in Greek and preserved in the Apocrypha. The celebration commemorates the victory event. The word Hanukkah literally means dedication. Green continues on to explore this revolt by saying the Maccabean Revolt was a nativist Jewish reaction to the increasing Hellenization of Judea and the threatened disappearance of the distinctive religious culture of the Jews. Green adds that legend has it that when rededicating the temple from pagan defilement, the Maccabeans and the rulers found only a small flask of oil with the intact seal of the high priest, enough to last only a single day. Miraculously, the oil lasted 8 days until a new supply could be obtained. Thus, supposedly arose the practice of lighting candles on Hanukkah, with one additional candle added on each of the 8 nights. Green notes that the festival likely draws from other earth-based festivals where culture celebrated the darkness by lighting candles. The story of the Maccabees is a fight for Jewish identity. The burning of lamps is a symbol of religious practice. The fact that what was supposed to last for 1 night lasted for 8 was a miracle. The Union for Reformed Judaism on the subject of Hanukkah writes this: by returning to and reclaiming the temple, the Maccabees recommitted themselves to a Jewish way of life, to all they held dear. Thus, Hanukkah asks us to rededicate ourselves not only to Judaism, but to the values we place at the center of our faith. I wonder, what does this holiday mean in the year 2021, the year after the year when everything had to be reimagined, the year when there might be a shred of the normal, but it looks different? For starters, in this year where we are never sure if we will have enough energy to light, to get through the day, or enough oil in lamps, the miracle of the light lasting 8 days instead of 1 says, yes, it is possible. You have resilience and a lasting power in you that you did not know was possible. A feeling that there is enough when you weren't sure that there would be. This is a story about making a sacred place holy again after it has been destroyed. My friends gathered at this time watching this with united in purpose and intent. Hanukkah is a holiday about slowly watching the light come back into the world. A light about watching a little bit more hope come into the world. This is a time about slowly watching the light grow into the world. And perhaps a little bit more hope. May it be so, and amen.